Hello, and welcome to Fox Construction. I'm Chris Rainwater, owner of Rainwater Safety Consulting, a safety consultant to Fox Construction. On behalf of Sarah Fox and the entire Fox team, we're glad you're here. Nothing is more important to Fox than your safety and the safety of your coworkers. Fox has a great safety program. They have an award-winning safety program. And part of this program is the safety plan that we're going to go over today. Before we get started, make sure you have a copy of the Fox safety plan in front of you. Follow along carefully as I go through this training. I encourage you to take notes, pay very close attention, and be sure to make a note of any questions that you might have for Sarah, your team members, or me. Ready to go? Let's get started. Let's go to page 5 of the safety plan, where you'll find the safety plan statement accident prevention program. Now, this is Sarah Fox's statement on Fox's safety policy. I'd like you to take a minute to read it. It's a very important statement. It is Fox's philosophy when it comes to safety. After you've read it, ask yourself a couple of questions. Is there any doubt that the most important thing at Fox Construction is your safety? The statement makes it very clear. Nothing, not even the construction and production at the work site is more important than safety. Safety is the first thing that you should be thinking of. Safety should be incorporated into everything that you do. They aren't two separate things. There's not work over here and safety over there. It's safety incorporated into every single thing you do. And that is Fox's safety philosophy. And it's a great philosophy. In fact, you could even say it's a philosophy to live by. Take a minute to read it before we go to the next section. Starting on page 6, you're going to see what we call safety responsibilities. When you take a look at the safety responsibility section, what you're going to see is that everybody has specific roles when it comes to safety at Fox Construction. The president, which is Sarah Fox, has the responsibility to manage and lead the program overall. She gives her full support to the program. She ensures that the superintendents have her full support when it comes to safety. The safety responsibility section also points out the responsibilities for your operations manager, your project managers, estimators, and engineers, your superintendents, employees, and even myself. Take a minute to look over the employee responsibilities, especially as they pertain to you. And then we'll move on to the next section. So what good would any safety policy be if you didn't have a means to enforce it? In a perfect world, Fox Construction would never have to issue disciplinary actions for safety violations. And we hope there won't be any safety violations. But in the event that there are, Fox has a very clearly spelled out safety disciplinary policy. Take a few minutes to look it over, and you'll see that it is a reasonable, fair, progressive disciplinary policy. Now, does Fox have the right, like every single employer, to jump straight to termination, even on the first offense? Of course they do. That's Fox's responsibility to make that determination if the safety violation was serious enough to go straight to a higher level of disciplinary action, up to and including termination. So take a few minutes to look this over and understand your responsibilities and what could happen in the event that there is a safety violation. On page 9 of the policy, you're going to see something that says new employee orientation. Guess what? That's what you're doing right now. So go on to page 10, where I want to talk about employee concerns. Now, everybody knows what OSHA is. And OSHA requires that we tell you that if you have safety concerns, safety problems, safety complaints, you can go straight to OSHA. That's absolutely true. And now we've told you that. However, we have a comprehensive safety program. And we have a million different ways for you to express your concerns and your complaints. You can talk to your job superintendent, the operations manager, the office manager, the president of the company. You can bring it up at a safety meeting. There are a lot of ways for you to express your safety concerns. Fox is a great company to work for and would never even consider retaliating against an employee for expressing a safety concern. But you also need to know that it is illegal for an employer to retaliate against an employee for raising a safety concern. You should never have any concern whatsoever when you express a safety complaint or a suggestion to any one of the people listed on page 10. It's extremely important that you, as an employee on the ground, seeing everything, report your safety concerns and your complaints and your suggestions to anyone on this list. That way, we can solve the problems in-house quickly before anyone gets injured and before anyone has to go to OSHA. On page 11, we're going to talk about accident reporting and record keeping. Federal law and state law require very prompt reporting of any accident or injury, including near misses. We'll talk more about near misses a little bit later. But for right now, it's important that you know this. If you experience a near miss or an injury, if there's an incident, it's important that you report it immediately to your superintendent or the operations manager. They have a requirement in turn to report it on the same day to the Fox Construction office manager. Time is of the essence when it comes to these events. Think about it for a second. If you're injured, we need to make sure that you get prompt assistance. We also need to make sure that we've done a prompt, quick, thorough investigation to determine the root cause so that we can find out what happened and then take actions to prevent it from ever happening again. In the event of a near miss, we get a freebie. We get a chance to go ahead and take a look at that, what almost happened, and how can we prevent it from happening again. Prompt reporting is essential at Fox Construction. If something happens, you need to report it. Don't let it go. Don't think that you'll report it later because you'll forget it, or you might forget it. So go ahead and report it immediately. Not only is it the law, it is Fox Construction's policy. On page 11, we're going to talk about accident reporting and record keeping. Federal law and state law require very prompt reporting of any accident or injury, including near misses. We'll talk more about near misses a little bit later. But for right now, it's important that you know this. If you experience a near miss or an injury, if there's an incident, it's important that you report it immediately to your superintendent or the operations manager. They have a requirement in turn to report it on the same day to the Fox Construction office manager. Time is of the essence when it comes to these events. Think about it for a second. If you're injured, we need to make sure that you get prompt assistance. We also need to make sure that we've done a prompt, quick, thorough investigation to determine the root cause so that we can find out what happened and then take actions to prevent it from ever happening again. In the event of a near miss, we get a freebie. We get a chance to go ahead and take a look at that, what almost happened, and how can we prevent it from happening again. Prompt reporting is essential at Fox Construction. If something happens, you need to report it. Don't let it go. Don't think that you'll report it later because you'll forget it, or you might forget it. So go ahead and report it immediately. Not only is it the law, it is Fox Construction's policy. OSHA's construction regulations found at 29 CFR 1926.1200 require that employers have a chemical hazard communication plan. Fox Construction has exactly that. It's important that you understand that the Fox Chemical Hazard Communication Plan follows the requirements of the globally harmonized system as required by law. The Fox Safety Plan has a thorough procedure for chemical hazard communication. On page 12, what you see here is simply Fox saying that we are complying with the law with regard to chemical hazard communication. Later in the plan is our full chemical hazard communication plan or policy, and you'll need to read that as well. All employees at Fox Construction receive training in chemical hazard communication or the globally harmonized system. On pages 13 and 14 of the Fox Safety Plan, you're going to see confined space. Now, all of you probably know what confined space is. However, let's go over it just a minute. So a confined space is simply a space that has limited ingress and egress. It is not intended for permanent human inhabitation and is essentially a small space that you'll be working in. Think about a confined space like a manhole. A manhole is a confined space, but is it a permit required confined space? And what makes a confined space permit required? Fox's confined space policy makes this clear. If you're doing work such as welding in a confined space, it becomes a permit required confined space. That permit triggers requirements for air monitoring to make sure there's enough oxygen and that there aren't hazardous chemicals or other elements present in the confined space. It requires an entrant and an attendant policy. It requires that employees be trained. It requires that certain people take responsibility for specific actions that allow us to work in a permit required confined space to ensure that our employees are safe while they are working in that space. You will receive training, if you haven't already, on permit required confined spaces. But take a few minutes to look over Fox's policy. On page 15, you're going to find Fox Construction's electrical safety policy. Now, Fox Construction is a general contractor, and it usually subcontracts with electricians to come in and do specific jobs. Those electricians, of course, are trained to a higher standard when it comes to electrical safety. Nonetheless, on an active construction site, you will be working around electricity. And it's very important that you understand Fox Construction's safety policy when it comes to electricity. First of all, Fox requires, absolutely mandates, lockout, tagout. What that means is if you have to service some equipment, it's very important that the energizing source, whether it's a cutoff switch or whatever, needs to be locked out and tagged out before you work on the equipment. That way, the equipment won't become energized while you're working on it and have you injured or killed. Unfortunately, that happens way too many times in the United States every single year. Lockout, tagout is absolutely required. Be constantly aware of the presence of overhead lines and where they are and where you are in relation to them. There are specific requirements with regard to the distance that you can work with regard to overhead lines and with the voltage that they're carrying. Yampa Valley Electric Authority will assist you with overhead lines where needed. Make sure that you've done your personal protective equipment PPE assessment to make sure that you've got the proper PPE on before you work on or near electricity. Make sure that your tools are the correct tools to be working on or around electricity. Are all tools made the same? Are they all ready to be worked on to use with electricity? No. Tools that are specific to electricity are a higher standard, built to a higher standard, and they are the correct tools to use. So make sure that you're using the correct tools. That's all. Finally, if you look on page 16, you're going to see good judgment. You know, in the safety field, we have a statement, I'm sure you've heard it before, and it is, you can't fix stupid. So a lot of injuries that we see in the field, somebody did something that was stupid. They didn't use good judgment at all. We need you to use good judgment. We need you to be cautious. We need you to be aware. More importantly, we need you not to take chances or fail to ask questions when questions should be asked. Don't worry about being embarrassed. Worry about being dead. Ask the questions, especially when it comes to electrical safety. The law requires that employers have what's called an emergency action plan. On page 17, in fact, page 17 through 19, you're going to find that Fox has an outline for an emergency action plan. Later in the policy, there is a full emergency action plan. What's an emergency? Well, something like a severe weather event would be an emergency. An earthquake would be an emergency. An active shooter, unfortunately, is an emergency. It's important that you know what Fox's emergency action plan is. Now, when you're on a job site, obviously the emergency action plan is different, and it has to be. At the job site, speak to the superintendent about what the emergency action plan is. Where would you shelter, for example, in the event of a severe weather event? And if you're at Fox's offices, it's important that you know certain things about how to get out, where the exits are, how many exits there are, where you would shelter there in the event of a severe weather event, and what you would do in the event of an active shooter situation. This is all contained in the Fox Safety Plan, and you are required to read that and make sure that you understand it. It's very important that you ask questions in case you don't know what to do in the event of an emergency. On page 20, you're going to find Fox's Emergency Injury Management and Accident Prevention Plan. Essentially, this feeds into what I said earlier about promptly reporting. Once you have reported, we're going to make sure that there is a thorough investigation. Not to point fingers, not to assign blame. That's never, ever the correct thing to do. The correct thing to do, and why we do investigations promptly, is to find out what went wrong. What was what we call the root cause, the basic cause. When you strip everything else away, what really caused something to happen? And then we're going to develop a prevention plan to make sure that, to the best of our ability, it never occurs again. Your participation in and cooperation in these investigations is very, very important. Again, there's no assigning blame here. This is, how do we keep people safe? What is more important than fall protection at a construction site? Not much. And here's why. Falls continue to be the number one killer of construction workers in the United States. OSHA has had fall protection standards in place since 1971. Richard Nixon was president. And yet, many employers still don't know what their duty is to provide fall protection to employees. Fox is not one of those employers. Fox knows what its responsibility is. And in fact, pages 21 through 33 of the safety plan cover fall protection. Now, what are the main forms of fall protection that you would expect to see on any construction job site? If you said a full body harness, you're right. That's the most common. We require that you wear a full body harness when you are in a situation where you must have fall protection. A full body harness that is the correct size, that is worn correctly, that is inspected daily before you use it, and formally inspected once a month, and that inspection recorded on the tag that's included with the harness. Don't just inspect your harness. You also have to inspect the lanyard. You also have to inspect anchor points. In fact, you have to inspect every component of the fall protection system. Remember, those inspections aren't just a regulatory requirement. They're there to save your life. Fall protection must be worn correctly, as I said, and it also must be used correctly. If you haven't had training on the fall protection equipment, if you're not sure how to wear it, if you're not sure how to use it, do not proceed. Make sure that you ask your superintendent for training. Ask questions. Failure to ask questions results in injuries and deaths every single year. Don't be embarrassed. If you don't know how to do it, ask the question. And that especially is important when it comes to fall protection. Take a few minutes to look through Fox's fall protection policy and make sure that you understand it fully. It's extremely important that you ask questions on any system, component, part that you don't quite understand. Your safety is dependent on the proper use of fall protection. It's important that you understand every component, every part of the fall protection system, and that you use it. Federal law requires that employers have a formal written fire prevention plan, and Fox has one. In fact, it starts on page 34 of your safety policy. Why do we need a fire prevention plan? Why is it important? It's important because every single employee has a responsibility to help us prevent fires. So make sure you know where your fire extinguishers are located. Make sure that they've been inspected and that they're ready to use. A fire extinguisher that hasn't been inspected and is not ready to use is not going to help you in the minute of the emergency of a fire when you need it. Also, trying to find a fire extinguisher in the smoke can be kind of tough. So again, make sure you know where they are located. Make sure you know Fox's policy with regard to the fire prevention plan. So if you look at the first page, you can see the types of hazards we're talking about. Electrical hazards, portable heaters, flammable and combustible materials, smoking. One of the things that I find most commonly on job sites is that the smoking areas haven't been designated and people are smoking everywhere. In fact, I have often found people smoking right next to flammable tanks. Not a good idea. So make sure that you have looked at Fox's fire prevention plan and that you understand your responsibilities under this plan. Page 41 of the Fox Safety Plan is titled First Aid. This really talks about first aid and CPR. We want as many people as we can to be trained in CPR and first aid. Obviously, that's a good idea because you never know what's going to happen at the job site. We certainly hope it's not necessary, but it could be. It's important that you remember that 911 must be called very quickly in the event that there is an event that would require CPR. It's also important that you know where the first aid kits are. Where are the first aid kits located on your job site? And where are the first aid kits located in your vehicles? Every Fox vehicle should have a first aid kit in it. It's important you know where it is and that you know how to use the materials that are inside the first aid kit. Obviously, it's important that employees are trained before they try to conduct CPR or first aid. If you're interested in receiving training in CPR or first aid, make sure you talk to your superintendent, the operations manager, or Sarah Fox. If it's determined that you're in a position that should have that training, the company will provide it. Make sure that you understand Fox's policy with regard to first aid and CPR. Remember also that it's important you not expose yourself to bloodborne pathogens. How can you get a bloodborne pathogen? Well, by exposing yourself to somebody else's blood or some other bodily fluid. It's important that if you are administering first aid, that you wear gloves. Let the victim try to help as much as possible. Make sure that you're not being exposed to the victim's blood or other bodily fluids, if at all possible. If you believe that you've been contaminated with blood or another bodily fluid, it is essential that you report it immediately so that Fox Construction can carry out its responsibility to make sure that you're also cared for. On pages 42 through 44, you're going to find Fox Construction's fleet and equipment safety policy. Now, let's talk about this for a minute. If you are going to operate a Fox vehicle, if you're going to operate your own vehicle on Fox business, or if you're going to operate equipment that belongs to Fox at a job site, it is extremely important, first of all, that you are legally capable of doing so. Do you have a valid driver's license? If your license is suspended or revoked for some reason, do not operate Fox equipment or your own equipment, your own vehicle on Fox Construction Business. Talk to the operations manager or Sarah Fox if that is an issue for you. Do not operate vehicles and equipment without a valid license. Now, if you have a valid license and you're operating Fox Construction vehicles and equipment, it's also very important that you remember to follow the rules. For example, if you're driving a vehicle on Fox Construction Business, even if it's your own, it's very important that you follow all of the traffic laws, that you're not speeding, that you're not driving reckless. Remember that you are both an ambassador for Fox Construction, one, and number two, you are a potential liability. All of us are. If we are driving in a way that we shouldn't be, if we're not wearing our seatbelt, if we are texting and driving and we're in a crash, Fox Construction would have liability. Let's make sure that we're following all the rules, we're not texting and driving, and that we are protecting both ourselves, our equipment, and Fox Construction. Now, the safety of the vehicles is also very important. Fox Construction requires that pre-safety inspections are done both on vehicles and equipment before they are used. It's important that you have the form, that you walk around, do the safety checks in the morning. It takes no more than 5 minutes, and ensure that the equipment that you're operating is safe. The other day, I saw one of my clients driving in a pouring rainstorm with one set of headlights working and the other set on the other side not. Now, what that told me was, first of all, it's very dangerous. And the other thing it told me is they didn't do the pre-use safety walk around, because if you did a pre-use safety walk around, you'd know if you had lights out. Make sure that you're doing your pre-use safety check per the Fox Construction safety policy. It's also very important that if you are in an accident while operating on Fox Business, that you promptly report it to the company. Make sure that we know an accident has occurred. Make sure you don't admit liability. Make sure that you're courteous and polite and helpful wherever you can be. Remember, again, you're an ambassador for Fox Construction. Let's make sure that even in the worst cases, even where we're at fault, we're doing everything we can to minimize and mitigate the damages. Pages 45 through 49 of Fox's safety plan talk about forklifts and using powered industrial trucks. Now, as you probably know, the law requires that if you're going to use a forklift, you have to have special training. You have to have forklift certification, as it were, including safety certification. If you haven't had that training, you cannot operate a forklift or other industrial equipment. Make sure that you've got the training first. It doesn't take long, no more than an hour, and Fox Construction will provide it for you. Make sure you notify your superintendent or Fox's president, Sarah Fox, if you don't have that training. We'll make sure that you get it before you operate a forklift. Now, it's also very important, not only that you're trained, but that you know some of the simple rules regarding forklifts. For example, when traveling, make sure that you have your seatbelt on. When you're on the forklift, your seatbelt should be on, period. Before it moves, seatbelt should be clicked. Make sure that you're traveling with your forks at the lowest safe position that you can. Make sure that you're traveling at safe speeds. Make sure that all of your safety systems work. Do that pre-use safety walk around. Are the strobes working? Does the horn work? Does the backup alarm work? Are there safety issues with the equipment? If you find safety issues with the equipment, whether it's a forklift or anything else, always report it to your superintendent to make sure that that equipment is repaired as soon as possible. We need that equipment in operation. Your observations of it and any safety deficiencies will be very helpful to us. So make sure that you report that promptly so we can get those issues fixed. Make sure that you understand that you're also required to get refresher training on forklifts. So if you haven't had refresher training in some time, it's important that we give you that refresher training as well. Make sure that you understand the general safe practices when it comes to operating forklifts or other general safety equipment. Make sure that you're not taking passengers. Forklifts and other industrial equipment are not taxis. Nobody should be riding on your equipment. Make sure that it's only you. No passengers allowed. If somebody says, give me a lift over to the other side of the job site, your response is no. Absolutely, every time. No passengers. Have you ever seen stacked items fall over or collapse? Of course you have. If you've been on the job long enough, everybody has seen that happen. Have you ever seen anybody injured when that happens? Unfortunately, I have. In fact, I've investigated 37 fatalities in my 30-year career. That's sad. That shouldn't happen. We want to make sure it doesn't happen to you. Recently, I investigated an accident where lumber was stacked incorrectly, and the lumber slid, collapsed onto an employee and broke his leg, dislocated his knee, broke his ankle, and crushed his foot. Those were pretty serious injuries that'll take him some time to recover from. And the mistake that was made by the folks who delivered the lumber, because where they said it was incorrect, unsafe, but also on the employee who didn't really look at the situation. And when he cut the lumber free, he was standing on the wrong side of it, and it came down on top of him. This is one of those cases where good judgment, being a little bit more careful, using a little more common sense, would have been a good thing. OSHA has a general materials handling regulation, and Fox has incorporated it into their policy. So if you look at page 54, you're going to see the general materials handling policy. Basically, this says, make sure that everything is stacked and racked correctly and safely. Don't stack stuff so high that it's going to be dangerous to get it down. Stack it correctly so that it's not going to slide or fall over. Make sure that you're using ramps or stairs to get to materials that are stored and now you need to access. Make sure that materials are properly signed. And what I mean by signed is make sure there are warning signs, danger signs, where appropriate, because people who aren't authorized to access those materials shouldn't be. And those who are need to remember, as in the situation I just stated, that there's a danger here, to be careful, to approach it carefully. Fox Construction requires that all of these materials, whether they're bricks or lumber or cement bags, are stored, stacked, racked correctly for your safety. If you think there's a problem with a storage issue on your job site, make sure you talk to your superintendent immediately so that that situation can be corrected. OSHA hates poor housekeeping, and they should. Poor housekeeping leads to all sorts of accidents and injuries, slips, trips, falls. In the event of a fire, poor housekeeping just gives more fuel to the fire, more stuff to burn. That's a bad thing. OSHA issues citations for general housekeeping, and they can be pretty hefty. In fact, an OSHA fine, a single OSHA fine for a serious violation, can be up to $12,650 for one single citation. Fox has a general housekeeping policy that starts on page 50 of the plan. It covers all working surfaces, floors, aisles, passageways, which must be kept clean and clear, unobstructed. It talks about how to make sure that the lighting is sufficient. And by the way, we can come in and do lighting tests to make sure that the lighting is sufficient. If you ever think you have insufficient lighting, that's a general housekeeping issue, let us know and we'll come in and do testing. What about extension cords? Extension cords are covered under electrical safety, but they're also covered under general housekeeping. Electrical cords that are strewn everywhere are a tripping hazard. And look at your extension cords also for nicks, cuts, scrapes, anything that has broken the outside insulation. So say it's an orange extension cord. If you see a break in that orange insulation on the outside of the cord, we have a big safety issue. That is covered under general housekeeping. Those cords should be taken out of service. Flammable and combustible storage. Obviously, flammables and combustibles require appropriate storage so that in the event that we have a fire, it can be more easily contained. We also have general safety practices within the good housekeeping, and it covers dust and general cleaning and general debris. And essentially, this is what Fox is saying. Make sure that you're cleaning up behind yourself. Make sure the flammables and combustibles are stored correctly. Make sure that extension cords aren't strewn out everywhere, and make sure that those extension cords are not damaged. Make sure that your work site is generally kept as clean as possible. Those steps prevent injuries. On page 56, you're going to find some of Fox Construction's general safety guidelines, and these make perfect sense. Take some time to look at every single one of these and let them sink in. Shavings, dust scraps, oil, or grease should not be allowed to accumulate. Think about that for a second. Trash should be removed as soon as possible. Aisleways, exits shouldn't be blocked. Don't take shortcuts. Shortcuts lead to injuries and accidents and often, unfortunately, fatalities. Always use spotters when backing a large vehicle. That's extremely important, especially on these job sites that have very, very little room for error. Make sure that flammables and combustibles are stored correctly. Make sure that your power tools are in good condition, that the cords aren't damaged, ripped, torn, and that the insulation is intact. Remove nails or bend them over from lumber. Nobody wants to step on a nail, and it's completely avoidable. Make sure that you're wearing the correct personal protective equipment, PPE. So I've gone over a few of them, but it's your responsibility to read all of them and make sure that you understand them. And again, as with every section of this policy, make sure you ask questions. So remember earlier when I talked about the hazard communication program? Well, now we're at that part of the plan. Now, I'm not going to give the hazard communication training right here in this new employee orientation video, but I will give you a few points, okay? It's very important that all secondary containers, like a spray bottle, are properly labeled so that we know what's in that container. If you see a secondary container, like a spray bottle, and it doesn't have a label or it doesn't have something written on there with a Sharpie, for example, that says this is glass cleaner, for example, then that's a violation. We need to make sure that we have that properly labeled. There are also hazard communication policies that you need to understand with regard to safety data sheets. They used to be called material safety data sheets. Now they're just called safety data sheets. And that you have an absolute right to see a safety data sheet. How would you get a safety data sheet if you wanted one? You would ask your supervisor or your superintendent in this case. Your superintendent will then provide you with a safety data sheet on his or her phone, tablet, or other electronic device. We don't keep printed safety data sheets because these days we're able to pull them up on the phone instantly. If you'd like a printed copy of an SDS, just tell your superintendent. They'll make sure that within 24 hours, you get a printed copy of the SDS. You have an absolute right to see an SDS. We want to make sure that you understand that, and we want to make sure that you understand how to get one. How do you get one again? Ask your superintendent to see it. We also have a chemical inventory sheet so that we know exactly what chemicals we're working with and in which quantities. We also want to make sure that they're properly stored, as we've talked about earlier in this video. It's important that you understand the globally harmonized system and all of the placards or pictograms now that are used in that system. We'll make sure you get that training also. It's an hour-long class, required that you have it by law. We'll make sure that you get that. We have a robust hazard communication system at Fox Construction. It's very important to us that you understand the chemicals that you use and the hazards that are associated with those, what to do in the event of a spill or exposure. Again, this is very important. And if you have any questions, please ask your superintendent, your operations manager, or Sarah Fox. On page 59, you're going to find the job site safety inspection guidelines. Now, there's a form in the safety plan that allows you to go and document hazard assessments on the job site. Let's clarify what we're talking about here. We want you to take time to make sure you understand the hazards that are present on your job site. It's important that you not just go in and go straight to work and ignore obvious hazards. It's important that you take a few minutes to look around and know what hazards exist so that you know what to do and how to protect yourself. For example, is there certain PPE that you should be wearing while you're on the job site because of a specific hazard? There probably is. And in fact, Fox requires certain PPE to be worn on every job site. So take a look at the job site hazards, make sure that you've evaluated them, make sure you understand what control measures you should put in place. In other words, what should you do to protect yourself and your coworkers from that hazard? Can the hazard simply be removed from the job site, or does something else have to be done instead? So it's very important that you know these hazards in advance. That way you can take the appropriate measures and prevent an injury in the beginning. All right, so that brings us to page 60 and ladder safety. You know, it's so easy to underestimate a simple portable ladder. I mean, we see them all over the place on job sites. We've used them constantly. So we kind of start taking them for granted. And unfortunately, ladder accidents saw a dramatic rise in 2017 in the OSHA figures for injuries. What that means is that we need to slow down and look at our ladders a little more carefully. Ladders should be inspected, for example, before you use them. You never, ever simply walk up to a ladder, put it in place, climb up, go to work. A ladder must be inspected first. Wouldn't you want to know if one of the rungs was damaged or missing? Wouldn't you want to know if the ladder's going to collapse or fall over while you're up on it? It's important, isn't it? So ladders should be inspected before you use them. They also have to be formally inspected with a label placed every 6 months. Fox Construction does that. If you see that your ladder is out of date or not inspected, talk to your superintendent. Ladder safety also means using the ladder correctly. So do we stand on the top rung? Do we stand on the very top? You'd be amazed at how many times I see that, even though everybody knows not to do it. So when it comes to ladder safety, make sure it's inspected, make sure it's safe to use, make sure it's used correctly every time. What would we do without our tools? Well, on a construction job site, not much. So it's extremely important that our tools are in good, safe working order. Now, some tools come with guards. Those guards must be used. We don't disable guards. We certainly don't remove guards. Those tools, with their guards in place as designed, must be used in a safe manner. We must inspect the tools to make sure that they're not broken or damaged in some way. That includes that electrical cord. Make sure that that electrical cord is not damaged in any way. If it is, then we can't take that tool on the site and use it. Are you using your own tools? Are you bringing your own tools to the site? Then they fall under the same standard as the tools provided by Fox. Make sure that they're safe to use, that you've inspected them first. If they have guards, make sure those guards remain in place and in use. Make sure that you're trained on how to use the tools and that you're using them correctly within the manufacturer's specifications. Unfortunately, tools are misused way too often. And again, I think this is an area where some people take it for granted. They've been using that same tool forever. And so they've never been injured before. So what's there to worry about? Well, we kind of get into this rut and suddenly, guess what? The tool is not our friend. And we have an injury, or we have a finger or two lost. Tools are dangerous. Tools have to be inspected and used safely. And Fox Construction requires it absolutely every time. Uh-oh, OSHA just showed up at your job site. Now what do you do? At Fox Construction, we have very specific requirements for how employees conduct themselves if an OSHA agent or agents should arrive on the site. Remember that OSHA agents are federal agents with badges and with arrest authority. They are not just compliance officers. They're not just administrative folks there to give you a hard time. These are federal agents, so let's treat them accordingly. In fact, it's very important that you treat an OSHA agent like a member of the family. Make them feel welcome, make them feel at home. Take them to the job superintendent immediately, and the superintendent will make sure that the appropriate folks at Fox, including myself, are called to come out and to deal with OSHA. In the meantime, it's important that you understand that OSHA agents should be told that company officials, including their safety consultant, have been notified of the agent's arrival and are on their way to deal with the OSHA agents. What if you're asked a safety question? What if the OSHA agent says, hey, that's fine, but tell me about the PPE you're wearing? Your answer should be extremely respectful. For any safety question that you're asked, you should say this: with all due respect, agent, our company officials or our safety consultant have been notified and they are coming here now. I'd rather wait and let you talk to them. Now, that's a completely acceptable response. Just be very, very polite. What are some things you don't do when OSHA agents show up? Well, you don't put your tools down and stop working. That's an old wives' tale, as we say. OSHA agents, remember, are federal agents. You're not going anywhere. They're not going to let you leave the job site. And if you put your tools down and stop working, guess what? The OSHA agents are going to be highly suspicious that something is not right here, and they're going to do a very, very thorough inspection. Don't do that. Also, make sure that you make them as comfortable as possible. If there's a job site trailer, take them to that. Offer them some water, but make sure that they don't commence the inspection of the job site until company officials or myself arrive. That's your right. That's our company's right. And they will respect it as long as we are polite. Let's not give them a reason to be angry or to take out whatever is going on in their personal lives on Fox Construction. On page 65, you're going to find the outdoor heat exposure policy. Now, Steamboat Springs is known for its cold weather, not its hot weather. However, in the summer, does it get hot enough here that we should be concerned about heat safety? Absolutely. So this policy essentially spells out some of the basics. So, for example, you should dress appropriately for the weather. You should drink plenty of water. You should take more frequent breaks depending on the heat index. You should be trained to understand what types of heat injuries can occur and what the first aid is for those. And we'll provide that training to you later. But it is very important that you understand that there are specific policies, specific procedures that we expect our superintendents and our employees to take in the event of very hot weather. We don't want an employee falling out and having a heat injury or having an injury that is related simply to exhaustion from working in the heat or not drinking enough water or wearing clothes that are too warm. There are a lot of different things that we can do to protect you, and we expect you to cooperate and use some common sense with us when it comes to really hot weather. You'll get further guidance from the superintendents when the hot weather sets in, but it's important that you know that we do have an outdoor heat exposure policy and that we are going to be monitoring the conditions and how we respond to those conditions very closely. Now we're on page 66, and one of what I think is the most important topics, and that's personal protective equipment, PPE. You know, PPE is meant to be the last line of defense when it comes to safety, not the first, not even the second. There are three lines of defense. One is we engineer problems out. We just remove the problem completely. That's not always possible. In fact, it's rarely possible. The second line of defense is that we put rules in place. We put signs in place. We put labels in place. We put policies in place. We say, don't do this or don't do that. And that's how we try to prevent it. And that's usually possible. But the final line of defense is PPE. If the first two fail, the third one is meant to limit or prevent an injury if we can. So PPE is very important. And when I see it not used or I see it misused is when I see an injury. For example, safety glasses. Where should safety glasses be? Probably over your eyes, right? So when I come up to an employee and say, where are your safety glasses? And they say, they're in my truck. My natural response is, then your truck's eyes are very safe, but yours are not. So Fox has a policy with regard to personal protective equipment, and it's very important that you follow it. So for example, on every job site, hard hats are required. Composite or work boots are required. You're required to have gloves and hearing protection on your person so that you can use them when you need them. You're required to have safety glasses on any active job site. It's important that you understand that the correct PPE can save life and limb. And if we see you not wearing PPE correctly or not wearing it at all, it's the fastest way to get a disciplinary action. Please don't become a statistic. Don't force us to give you a disciplinary action. Just wear your PPE. It's absolutely required, and it will absolutely keep you safe. If you ever have a question about what specific PPE is required on a specific job site at a specific time, make sure you talk to your superintendent about that issue. They will give you the final determination. Let's talk about respiratory protection, which starts on page 68 of the plan. You know, OSHA requires that employers jump through all sorts of hoops when it comes to respiratory protection, and that includes, believe it or not, even a simple dust mask. Think of it like this. When you wear a dust mask, is it easier to breathe or harder to breathe? Well, it's harder to breathe, even if it's just a little harder to breathe. Imagine if you're wearing a half-face respirator. Is it easier to breathe or harder to breathe? The problem is that not everybody's respiratory systems are strong enough to wear a respirator, sometimes even a dust mask. So I may put on a respirator and be able to work all day with no problems. Another person might put on a respirator and collapse 30 seconds later because it's too much of a strain on their respiratory system. So OSHA has very specific respiratory protection policies, and Fox Construction has a respiratory policy as well. If you are required to wear a respirator, you will be receiving certain steps. You'll have to go through certain steps. So for example, you'll have to fill out an OSHA questionnaire that you'll take to a physician to determine whether you need a pulmonary function test. The pulmonary function test you have to pass in order to wear a respirator. That test is to determine whether or not your system is strong enough to wear a respirator. Then, once you pass that test, you have to go through some respiratory protection training that I provide. It's only an hour long, and it's about how to care for your respirator, how to store it, how to use it correctly, how to wear it correctly. You'll have to go through a fit test to make sure that air is not getting in around the seal of the respirator. Do you have a good seal? Obviously, if contaminants are coming in and you're breathing them in, then the respirator is useless. And so we have to make sure that you've got a good fit. There are just a bunch of steps that you'd have to go through in the event that you need to wear a respirator. But Fox Construction will make sure that all of those steps are followed, that you have the correct training, that you have the fit test, the pulmonary function test, and that you're provided with the appropriate respirator for the job. That's Fox Construction's respiratory policy. Make sure that you're not wearing any form of respirator, including a dust mask, if you haven't had the training, the fit test, etc. If you think there's a discrepancy or an issue, make sure you talk to your job superintendent, the operations manager, or Sarah Fox. So Fox Construction has a return to work policy. You see it on page 70. And what is a return to work policy? Simply, it's this. If you are injured on the job and you are given certain restrictions by your physician. So let's say you can't lift more than 20 pounds. We're going to make sure we honor those restrictions, but we're going to bring you back to work. We want you working and earning your full pay at your full hours, because on workers' compensation, when you're missing time, you're only going to be paid 66% of your average wage. Can you afford to live on 66%? I can't. So Fox Construction's policy is that if it's at all possible, we are going to bring you back to work in a modified or light duty capacity to conduct work for Fox Construction that honors your restrictions until you get better, until you fully recover and are fully released, and then can return to your normal duties. If it's not possible to bring you back, then it's not possible. We can't. But if it's at all possible, Fox Construction has a return to work policy that will provide light or modified duty to you that honors your restrictions and honors full work. Page 71 covers signs, signals, and barricades. And this simply is a policy that says that where barricades are needed, you must use them and they must comply with OSHA and ANSI standards. And where signs or labels are required, they will be used. So warning signs, danger signs, all the signs that you can think of that are used on an active construction site must be used, must be in place. Labels, warnings must be in place. They must comply with the OSHA standards. Now, if you flip over to page 72, you're going to see slings. Now, when we're talking about slings, we're talking about lifting. So slings that are used as lifting devices are extraordinarily important. Slings have to be inspected formally, actually twice a year. Are they fraying? Is there damage? Is there something that might keep them from doing the job safely? After all, these are going to be lifting some pretty heavy stuff. You don't want them to break. You don't want them to rip, tear, and drop their load. So it's very important that slings are inspected before every use, formally inspected twice a year, and that you understand how to use slings correctly. It's very important that you understand that employees never, ever work under a suspended load. That probably is some common sense for you, but never, ever work under a suspended load, because if the slings break, then somebody can get seriously injured or killed. And in our community, that happened as recently as 2016. We don't want that to happen to anyone at Fox Construction. Pages 73 through 78 cover scaffolding. Now, I have conducted thousands of job site inspections, and I bet you that the number one form of violation I have found is with scaffolding. Scaffolding always has something wrong with it. And when you think about it, you're climbing up this scaffolding, working pretty high off the ground, and your life depends that the scaffolding is set up correctly and that you're accessing it correctly, that you're using fall protection on it correctly. And if you're not doing it, and if these things aren't done, then the scaffold might collapse and people get killed. If you think that that doesn't happen, Google it. Look at YouTube. There are a lot of videos out there of scaffolding collapsing. And it's very, very sad because people get seriously injured or killed. We don't want that to happen on any of our job sites. So here's some basics from the policy that I want you to understand. And also, obviously, like all other sections of the policy, you need to read it. But you need to make sure that scaffolding has secure base plates. Often I find scaffolds that are being used with the poles simply driven into the ground or on the ground. That's not correct. Every pole on the scaffold must have a base plate. If the scaffolding is erected on something other than a concrete or asphalt hard surface, you must also use mud seals, which are wood blocks. So if I see a scaffold set up, say, on a dirt surface, I would expect to see a base plate set up on a mud seal. You also must make sure that scaffolds are fully planked, meaning that there are planks all the way across the levels of the scaffold. That is the most common finding. Make sure also that employees are accessing the scaffolding correctly. Make sure that employees aren't climbing up the scaffolding using, for example, the cross braces. That is incorrect and shouldn't be happening. Make sure that employees who are on scaffolds are using fall protection where the scaffold does not provide a toe board, mid rail, and top rail all around the employee. Again, this is where the full body harness comes in. These are just some basics from the scaffolding policy that you need to understand and to make sure that if you're not clear on what a scaffold should look like and how you should access it and how you should use it and what PPE you should be wearing or fall protection you should be using, that you talk to your superintendent and make sure you're very clear. As with all things in the Fox Safety Program, never ever assume or fail to ask a question. The only stupid question is the one you didn't ask. On page 79 of the Fox policy, you're going to find its spill prevention and response policy. Now, it's unlikely, but it can occur that a spill of chemicals occurs and now we have a volume discharge. We may have a safety event. We may have an environmental event. It's important that you understand that Fox has this policy, that we have the appropriate spill kits, either in the vehicles or on the site, and that employees are trained on how to properly respond to a spill. Now, think of it in these terms. If you were in a garage, like a mechanic's garage, and there was a small oil spill, you'd probably put kitty litter or something like that on it to absorb it. Well, that's sort of what we're talking about here, although it would probably be a different substance. If it's a hazardous substance, then you're going to know about it in advance because we tell you about hazardous substances that are on the job site through our hazard communication program that we already talked about. If you don't know what to do in the event of a spill, get away from it. Talk to the superintendent. The superintendent will make sure that an appropriate response is made. If emergency authorities are required to be called, the superintendent will make sure that they are called immediately. If the superintendent is not on site and you believe that an emergency exists, obviously you should summon emergency authorities by calling 911. Fox will, at every opportunity, in the event of a spill, make sure that it is contained with the spill kit that is on site or in the superintendent's vehicle. In any event, if something happens and there's a spill and you're not sure what to do about it, just get away from it. Make sure that other employees get away from it. The last thing we want, the very last thing we want, is an employee exposure to some chemical that has spilled. Don't think that you have some responsibility to contain it when you have no training and you don't know what to do about it exactly. If you have a question, get away. If you've had the training and you have the spill kit and you can contain it, by all means, you should. On page 81 of the policy, we find stairs and rails. So, as you know, in the construction of homes or commercial buildings, we often have to put in some temporary stairs, and that also includes that we put in temporary stair railing. It's important that those stairs meet OSHA requirements. It's also important that the rails meet OSHA requirements. So, for example, if railing is set up, the railing must be able to withstand 200 pounds of downward pressure in an instant. Now, a lot of the temporary railings that I've inspected would never meet that requirement. Somebody that was 200 pounds or greater who leaned on that railing or fell against that railing would inevitably fall to a lower level. Remember, that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent somebody from falling more than 6 feet to the next level. And often it's a much greater distance than 6 feet. You should see railings around, for example, swimming pools that are more than 6 feet. You should see railings around basements or other construction, other holes, indentations that are greater than 6 feet. And those rails must meet the 200-pound requirement. Temporary stairs must be built to OSHA requirements and must be used in accordance with OSHA requirements. When you see stairs without railings or you see it set up improperly, make sure you talk to the superintendent. because we want to make sure that you're not falling, and nobody's falling. Subcontractors, Fox employees, safety inspectors to the next level. So make sure that the stairs and the railings meet the OSHA standards and are in place. So page 83 is our substance abuse policy. Now, let's talk about this for a second. We understand that Colorado is a state where cannabis, marijuana, is legal recreationally. One of 3 states where you can actively just go into a store and buy marijuana. And a lot of people do. And you may be one of them. Fox doesn't have a position on that. That's your business. That's not Fox's business. But when does it become Fox's business? Well, let's talk about that for a second. It becomes Fox's business if you show up impaired. We can't have folks who are stoned, high, impaired on marijuana or any other substance, including alcohol, on our job sites, right? That's a dangerous situation. So don't come to work impaired on anything. Now, what about a prohibition against the use of drugs and alcohol? Fox isn't going to prohibit that use. We're just going to expect you to act responsibly by using it, if you use it at all, when you're not on duty, responsibly, so that you don't come to work and affect the job site. Now, do we reserve the right to test you for drug use? Absolutely. So if you are injured, you might receive a post-accident drug test. If we see signs or symptoms that you might be impaired, you may get what's called a reasonable suspicion drug test. Fox does conduct drug and alcohol testing. So please act responsibly. Use, if you use it all, responsibly, and make sure that it does not affect Fox Construction. We will take action if we believe that your use is affecting your job safety, or the safety of others at Fox Construction. Page 97 of the policy covers workplace violence. This is pretty simple. We don't tolerate workplace violence. We don't tolerate raised voices. We don't tolerate using obscene words or gestures against your coworkers. We certainly do not allow weapons on the site. In essence, what we want you to do is to be polite, courteous, professional at all times while on a Fox Construction job site. We will not tolerate violence in any form or fashion. We won't tolerate fighting. We won't tolerate loud arguments. We won't tolerate any instigation or violent actions of any type on Fox Construction job sites. That may be the quickest way to get fired. So leave your personal issues at home. If you have issues with a coworker or an employee, make sure you bring it to the attention of the superintendent, the operations manager, or Sarah Fox for resolution. Do not try to resolve it yourself and end up in a violent confrontation at work. If there's something that you can't handle or a person that you just can't work with, it's important that you tell us and let us try to work it out with you and the other person. We want you to be happy at Fox Construction. We want you to be happy and safe on the job site. So please, that's our violence policy, our workplace violence policy. Congratulations. You have now completed the Fox Construction new employee safety orientation. Now you're going to be given some forms to sign, safety acknowledgement forms that say you received this training, that you received a copy of the safety policy. And it's very important that you understand that this is the opportunity you have to ask some questions. You can always ask questions on the job sites, of course. But now that you're receiving this training, it's important that if you have questions or you had notes to make a question, to ask a question, do it now. Do it now. And let's make sure that you get out on the job site fully informed with no questions at this point, that you're satisfied with the safety orientation training you've received. It's very important that you do that now and not later. Certainly do it before you sign the acknowledgement form. Hey, welcome to Fox. I look forward to seeing you around. Have a great day. Blah, blah, blah.